And yeah, so is it your first time in Greece?
No, I come quite often. I really like the place. And Athens is a fantastic city, so I'm glad to be back. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here. I'm Alessandro, as Giulia mentioned. I'm here today to talk about social butterflies, or how Ubisoft leverages the dynamics of multiplayer groups in live games. So I work at Massive, is a studio, a Ubisoft studio in Sweden, and the games that we are working at is The Division. Just to have an idea, who of you knows of the game Tom Clancy's The Division? Okay, and how many actually played it? Still okay, that's good. So basically, it's at Ubisoft, we invested a lot in building a data science capacity to try to understand the behavior of players from the large amount of data that they, relinquish when they're playing. We built pretty much every single game in the last few years, able to track and record the interaction of players with the game. Obviously, we don't overdo it. Everything is anonymized. Everything is compliant to GDPR. I need to mention that. But the data that we gather are quite granular. So we collect every type of interaction. We stop short of collecting movement location because that would make it a bit unfeasible bandwidth-wise. So I'm here to talk about social butterflies. Basically, I just need to give you a little bit of background on the game, because in case you don't know what it is like, you need to understand what are the mechanics that we are monitoring to understand player behavior. So it's an online-only open-world RPG shooter set in Manhattan. It was the biggest new IP launch in history when it came out. Up to date, we have 20 million players. And you can have, it transforms Manhattan into a big playground where you can engage in player versus player or player versus environment activities. And each activity can be done in a group with 3 other people or solo. The story is fairly simple. There's a smallpox epidemic during Black Friday spread through the use of money, so there's a bit of a social criticism of capitalism. But basically, it throws civilization down to the ground, and you have to rebuild. You are one of the agents of the division that is asked actually to help, restore order in this anarchy, new anarchy. Just to give you a flavor and an understanding of what the game is like, we're going to see a trailer, very short.
I trained for a scenario like this my entire life. But it's worse than anything we could have imagined. We don't have much intel, and we don't have the luxury of failure. Not with Manhattan under lockdown and Brooklyn on the brink. People like me and you, we're what's left to hold the line.
Every criminal group that we've been dealing with is controlling most of these neighborhoods. Taking whatever they want, killing whoever they want, because we got nobody to stop them. Burn them! An area this size, this many bad guys, I just don't like the idea of throwing you to the wolves.
Captain, we are the wolves. These are my people. This is my city. We're taking it back.
Okay, so the key takeaway from here is that this is a live game. what they call games as a service. I'm sure you've heard this buzzword before. At Ubisoft, is internally referred as live games. And this means that the game requires a constant online connection to be able to play, whether you play single player or multiplayer. This is because at any given time, you can either ask your friends to join, or join your friends, or join random people, or ask random people to join you. And these 4 methods of creating groups are key to understand what we want to do now, what we want to understand, what we want to examine in the multiplayer part of the game. So the key concept that we want to probe is social contagion, which basically means if you go with a wolf, you start, howling like a wolf. Basically, we start doing what our network does. There are 2 important key concepts here. First is that there are some people that are more important than others within a social network. So I'm not talking about democracy here. I'm just saying that some people are more visible or more charismatic than others. Their behavior seeps and infects other people more than other people. So this is the first insight. And the second is that we actually have noticed in a lot of social networks that people start behaving similarly within each community. I'm talking about social network because for this type of analysis, we use something called social network analysis, which is more or less new branch of data science that looks at the interplay of users. So the 2 main things we want to do is to identify people that seems to have more influence than others, and second is to measure their impact concretely. What does it mean for the community? I have called them influencers, but I realized that it may be very misleading. Normally, influencers is referred to people on YouTube or Twitch. There are people with a certain level of authority, and they have univocal direction. It's from the influencer to the rest of the population, the flow of information. Instead, what we are looking at here, it's naturally grown grassroots influencers that are more influencing because of what other people see in them. It's not because of any given authority. It's not because they have a stage on which they are speaking from. So what we're looking for is who plays with whom, who creates groups, who invites whom to groups, how often, for how long, how frequently, and how do they play together, how do they interact. We have collected a sample of 246,000 players. 246,000 players, and within this sample, we wanted to, first of all, identify if there are any influencers, and then, in order to understand their impact, we also wanted to compare with power users. So influencers are, we'll see how they were identified, but they are defined by how much they create groups, basically, while power users, they are identified by how much they play. People with more than 70 hours playtime, people with more than 10 friends, and people with the top 5% of gear score, which is a way to basically assess your setup, the weapons you have, the armor, and everything. So the power users are really the top performers in the game, while the influencers are just people that create atomic groups, shortly said. So in order to identify the influencers, we used, as I mentioned, social network analysis. And since there is not a lot of agreement on which measure to use to identify people with influence, we use all of them, basically. We use a mix of measures of centrality and measure of prestige. I understand that this is not a very technical audience, so maybe you don't much care about this stuff, do you? Should I go in depth or not? Okay, let's go in depth. So basically, these are the 6 measures we use. And we did a quick correlation study to see if there's any overlaps, if they are redundant, if they are actually revealing things that they're unique. And it turns out that there is a small overlap, but they all identify a different set of people. So what we decided to do was to look for the top scoring players in each one of the 6 measures and intersect it and only pick players that have a high score for each one of the 6 measures we looked at. So just to give you an idea, PageRank is an algorithm invented by Larry Page. That's why it's called PageRank. And it's what Google used from the very beginning to rank pages in their searches. In degree and out degree, they just look at the number of links going into a node and out from a node. Closeness is the shortest path, betweenness is the shortest path. Eigenvector is a collection of shortest paths, and closeness is how central a node is in the whole network. So this is a very quick and dirty crash course on social network analysis. What came up is this beautiful fireworky graph. Here you see represented the 246,000 players that we sampled. And what you see highlighted as big blobs are the 49 influencers we identified as an intersection of all the 6 measures we looked at. As you can see, most of them, except like very few exceptions, they're concentrated in the center. So the way to read this graph is that you can say every little node is a player. The color is the community of players that are related and playing together. The size is the importance, and in this case, the influence. But another thing is, for example, looking at the floating communities. There's a few of them, then there's some kind of peripheral communities, and then there's the general entangled communities, communities that have a lot of intersecting nodes from each other. Generally speaking, the 49 influencers we identified are all entangled. Very few are like very big, but kind of peripheral or floating. So, what does this mean for us? A general comparison between the power users and the influencers that we identified is that, so power users have an average playtime of 454 hours. Okay, just let this sink, 454 hours. While influencer is still very high, but is under 19. And I should mention that the average for the whole play population is like roughly over 70 hours. So influencers are not much more above the general population, while power users are. They play like a lot more. The number of friends for influencers, they have 208 friends. So when I'm talking about number of friends, I'm talking about number of friends either on PSN or on Xbox Live or on Uplay. So these are for each one of the 3 platforms, there are ways where you can add a friend to your profile. So 27 friends for power users, 208 for influencers. Number of extent of reach, this is number of people that each one of the influencers or the power users plays with. Influencers is 342, power users is 27. So what's important here is to actually compare this number and this, and this and this. So power users play with as many, pretty much their friends. They play only with their friends. While influencers have a larger number of friends, and they play with a lot more people than just their friends. So this is a key difference. Now, we wanted to, we have like a few hypotheses we want to test. We want to check, So we want to check if 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after, so for every friend that starts playing with either a power user or an influencer, do they change their behavior? So the 49 influencers, they played with 16,000 people. I forgot how many, but maybe 500 power users played with 1,300 people. Now, we pick the 16,000 and these 1,300, and we look at their play data 2 weeks before they start interacting with either influencer or power users, and 2 weeks after. And then we compare for 2 key features, the daily playtime and the social play ratio. Daily playtime, it's exactly what it means. The average amount of hours you spend playing when you're playing. While the social play ratio is the amount of time you spend in a group versus solo when you're playing. So the percent of time spent in a group. Now the results are particularly interesting because influencers push the playtime of their friends from 178 hours per day to 221 hours per day. The power users, the friends of power users play 339 hours before and 336 hours after, meaning there is no noticeable change in the amount of time played per day. While the ratio between solo and group play for friends of influencer before they start playing is 41% in groups before playing with influencer. It pushes up to almost 60% in the 2 weeks after they started playing with the influencer. For the power users, it starts at 60, which is already high, but it does not very much dramatically increase. So a first insight is that playing with influencers increases the amount of time you spend playing and increases the amount of time you spend playing in a group, quite a lot. While for the power users, the values are high to start with, but there is no noticeable change before or after playing with the power users. I think this is pretty big, and it's not all, we have more. So basically, another thing I wanted to check was, so like the summary is that as soon as a player starts interacting with an influencer, the play time goes up and the time in group goes up. This is very important because a live game lives on multiplayer interaction. If you connect and there's nobody to play, yes, of course you can play solo, but it makes it no different than other games. The added value of The Division or other live games is interaction with other players, doing things together, redoing over and over main mission and side missions together, or going to the dark zone, if you are familiar with what the game is about, and shoot each other in the face. You know? The other major insight we had is looking over 1 year, longitudinally, looking at the differences between what happens before and after. This number that you see here is a retention, which means how many people after a year are still playing. It's pretty high for both power users and influencers. I don't know if you are familiar with the retention rates for games in general, but averagely, across the board, you can look at something like 5 to 7% retention over a year. Now, for these two groups, we are over 20 and almost 30 for power users. So retention is much, much bigger than normal. And now we started also looking at, of all the people that started playing with influencers, how many became influencers themselves? Given the fact that influencer increases the amount of time played in general and increases the amount of time played in groups, we wanted to know how are they born and bred? How do they evolve? How are they created? Now, the influencers community, all the friends that play with influencers, 26% of the ones that are still active become influencers themselves. It's big, while 6% of this happens only with the power users. So, the next step we wanted to do was, okay, let's look into what motivates these influencers. Why are they interesting? And you will hear more about this tomorrow at Ahmad's lecture, if you're interested, at 12 o'clock. So at Ubisoft, we developed the Ubisoft Perceived Experience Questionnaire. If you are interested, it was recently published this summer at Foundation of Digital Games. So you can go to the Association for Computing Machinery Digital Library, and you can find it just by looking for UPEC, or ask me or Ahmad, and we can give you the paper. Basically, it's a questionnaire based on self-determination theory. Do you know what that is about? How many people know what is self-determination? Okay, one, nice. So very, very, very quickly, and I repeat, you will hear more about it tomorrow. So it's looking at the autonomy, competence, and relatedness of people. It's looking at how much people feel like they have agency in what they're doing. It looks at how much people feel they are becoming better at what they're doing, and how much they feel like they are a part of a whole. They're not lonely in the game, but they're actually connected to other entities, whether they are NPCs or players. We also added a pillar of presence, because that's kind of measuring how much you feel like you're immersed in the game. So we basically gave this survey to 7,000 so-called influencers that we identified, and to power users, and we wanted to compare what if there is a difference in one and the other. And it turns out that for several of the factors of the survey that we had figured out, there are very big differences between the communities. Given this, it is actually possible to start thinking about a predictive model to infer motivation for players that did not take the test, only based on their gameplay. So this is pretty big as well. And this is some work that we're starting at some point. So, concluding, the social butterflies are the community backbone. They have a wide reach, and they do have a big impact on the behavior of people that start playing with them. This means that, yeah, influencers are very different from power users, and they touch a large audience. They have an impact on behavior, and they, like for the future, we want to look at two different things. One is starting to flag people that could become influencers, and the other is actually to infer their motivation across the board, even if they did not take the survey. This is pretty much from me. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Alessandro. If someone wants to ask a question, there is a chance. All right, I have one question for myself. Who in the company should take care of working with that? Is it community manager?
So we're actually a team across different groups. There's people from the live ops, from analytics, there's data scientists, there's user researchers, and me that I'm a little bit between the two. So there's two teams, and there's about 3-4 people involved. And community development. Community developers are also part of it because they are the ones that actually have to act on these insights.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Yeah, so people who actually interact with the influencers.
Yes.
Question?
So when it comes to longevity in terms of playstyle, what's more influentials or the hardcore gamers?
Well, that's funny because until now, a lot of developers have focused on these power users. At Ubisoft, there is a program called the Star Players. That's what we're looking at. At the same time, we have been looking at traditional influencers, people on YouTube or Twitch, that make a difference at a lot of followers. While this is a relatively new insight, we kind of started looking at it last year. Last year, it was the first scratch. Now we actually went in depth, and we figured out that they have a bigger impact than we expected. So, yeah, I'm not allowed to say what plans we have to do with them, but yes, I mean, it's pretty big, yeah.
All right, one more question if there is, okay?
Hello, is it possible that power users, just because they are in the top 5%, just play only with the top 5% of players? That's why they don't change the behavior so much. But on the other hand, influencers play with players in all the player journey.
Yes.
So it might be a bias there.
You're very right. There is some form of self-fulfilling prophecy by just looking at the power users. That's why we also looked at the general population, a sample of people that are just normal players, and we did exactly the same analysis we did for the power users and for the influencers. I did not include it here because there's some amount of confidential information, and because it would have been like a overkill for the amount of time. But I can tell you that influencers also differentiate themselves radically from the general population. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one last question.
Hello, my question is pretty much similar with the previous guy. When I had an ethnographic research on Counter-Strike, and what I found out is that the gamers, the very good gamers, they are very interested in playing and tell the others through their gameplay that they are literate gamers.
Yeah.
So, have you searched if the influencers are light gamers or players, and if the other, the 5%, they are hardcore literate gamers, and this means a lot about their profile also. And
okay, for this sample, I can tell you that the 49 influencers we identified, none of them qualifies as a power user. So there is no overlap there.
All right, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Alessandro, for coming, and happy birthday again.
Thank you.
We're getting ready for the next speaker. He will start in about 2 minutes. Will be Harry. So Don't go far away. If you need translation from English into Greek, take headphones.
Yeah, gonna wait a
Let's
bit.
welcome our next speaker. This is Harry from Housemark. Let's welcome him on stage at the Athens Games Festival.
Hello, so let's get started. First of all, thank you all for being here today, and I'd like to thank, of course, Julia and Elena and the rest of the organizers for making this event happen. I think it's really amazing that these kind of initiatives are happening in Greece, and I'm honored to be invited here and to play my small part in this. So today, I'm going to be talking about Nex Machina, the most recent game that Housemark made, and I'm going to be reflecting on its inception, its release, a year after it was released, and some of the creative decisions that we went with during its creation. So before we start, I'd just like to introduce myself. So my name is Harry Kruger, and despite what the name suggests, I'm actually from Greece, from Kefalonia. And currently I'm living in Finland, where I'm working at Housemark as a game director. So I have a programming background, and as I started 10 years ago at Housemark with a game called Outland, where I was a gameplay coder. I then moved on and did a small side gig there, as you can see, with Angry Birds trilogy, and then I was given the role of lead programmer for the PS4 launch title Resogun. I then moved on and directed the 2 expansions for that, and I guess that gave me enough street cred inside Housemark to qualify for the director's role in our next project, which was Nex Machina. So, how did Nex Machina actually start? So at Housemark, and I could say that on a deeply personal level, there's always been a strong passion for the arcade spirit. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I played a lot of arcade games that really shaped my creative sensibilities. And out of all of those games that I played, there was always one that was really close to my heart, and that was Robotron, which came out in '82. Now, Robotron, okay, so the GIFs are working, that's good. So Robotron, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a very, very simple game. So there's been a robot apocalypse, you're trapped in this small arena, and you are, as the lone hero, are tasked with destroying the robots before they kill you, and save any humans that are still survivors along the way. And there was just something so magical about the elegance of its simplicity and the distillation of the arcade spirit that I've always found so inspiring. Because how did it manage to do so much with so little? And long story short, I was championing this inside Housemarque, saying, this is my dream project. I would just like to make this game, make a modern reincarnation of this game. Take the timeless gameplay values, give them a new coat of paint. So, long story short, that was approved. And as I was celebrating, high-fiving my teammates in slow motion and singing Kumbaya, meantime, in Vegas, there was this guy called Eugene Jarvis, who is actually the creator of Robotron, and he was there receiving a Pioneer Award at the DICE Awards 2014. So we approached him and said, hey, we love your games. He said, who the hell are you guys? And we showed him, of course, what we've done and how we've kept the spirit alive. And long story short, we agreed to collaborate together to make this game. So in many ways, this was the perfect storm, all the planets aligned, and it's one of the rare cases where what happened in Vegas did not stay in Vegas. So, if you think that this story is interesting, you're not the only ones. Luckily, we had a documentary crew filming the whole thing over the 2.5 to 3 years of its development, and it is going to be out fairly soon. It immortalizes this unique collaboration and covers all of the misadventures throughout the project's development. And right now, I'd like to show you a trailer of that. Can we get the trailer? No.
Can we get one of the videos that was together with the presentation?
It's the name of the game trailer.
Yes. Well, at least GIFs are working, right? At least the GIFs and the presentation are working.
Okay, there's something happening.